Hey, what's up guys? If you guys are anything like me, you've probably tried to put this tool off as long as you can. Right now I have a really small shop and I don't have a ton of room to keep sleds and jigs laying around, and I need to utilize that space as much as I can. So I decided to build a router sled that assembles to my workbench. It's easy to make, easy to assemble and take down and store whenever I'm finished with it. Keep in mind that everything that I'm using to make this jig is from scrap that I have left over from previous projects, but as you can see, it doesn't take long to put together and set it up for use. I started out by making my sled. So I used some 3/4 inch plywood. I am making this sled for my Dewalt Router, so I'm going to grab it and measure the base plate, which was 6 inches, and I took that number and added 3/4 to each side since I'm using 3/4 inch plywood, and I get a total length of 7.5. So once I measured that out on both ends, I set up my track saw and I ripped it. As far as the length for your router sled goes, that's personal preference. If you're making it to go on your bench like mine, you just want to make it a couple inches wider than your bench, but that is totally up to you and just whatever you're going to be setting up that router sled on. Once I had my base cut, I needed to make my rails, which I wanted to make 2 inches high. Again, that was just a personal preference, so I went ahead and measured 4 inches and 1/8 off of the piece of plywood, and then I took it over to my table saw to cut it in half. And if you're wondering where that 1/8 comes from, it just accounts for the width of that blade. That way, when I took it over to the table saw and ripped it in half, I'd have 2 pieces that were 2 inches wide. Now that I have my sled rails, I'm going to go ahead and put some Kreg jig holes in both of them so that I can mount it to the base. I just used a thin bead of glue, some 1 1/4 inch Kreg jig screws, and I got everything screwed into place. Once you get your rails on, grab your router, make sure it slides in nicely to your sled and that it isn't too tight, isn't too loose. Once I know that my sled is good to go, I took off my motor spindle and I stenciled out the cutout that I needed for my bit to sit in. So as you can see, I literally just traced it on there. So once I got that all drawn on there, I took a drill bit and I drilled a few pilot holes for your jigsaw to fit into and start cutting. Trying to stay as close to that line as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, and I'm sure you can probably go about other ways on this part. You can cut it probably with a table saw or your track saw or whichever you prefer, but this was the quickest and easiest way that I could think to do it, so that's the way I went with. Now that I'm finished with my sled, I'm moving on to the rails, and this is the part that can be taken off and reattached to your table as many times as you want because I used some threaded inserts. So I grabbed some more scrap and I cut these rails to 3 inches a piece, and you'll need 2 because you'll need one for each side. And the reason that I went with 3 inches is just because I rarely flatten anything over 2 to 2.5 inches. I am using 1/4 20 by 25 millimeter inserts here. I'll link that in the description in case you need to find some. And then I go ahead and I pre-drill and put my insert in the side of my table. And I didn't really have any rhyme or reason on the exact location for that because I will make sure everything is level from here on out. I add a little bit of wood glue before I screw my insert in just to ensure that it stays in place over time. Then I took one of my rails and I pre-drilled a hole for my screw to fit in. Also using 1/4 20 fasteners here. Then as you can see, I just fasten it into place. Now I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill my second hole in the rail, and I grabbed the level for this. I set the level up on the rail and I just finessed my rail until everything showed even. Once I had that in place, I took what I call a hole punch and I tapped in a small indentation in that hole that I just drilled so that I knew exactly where I needed to place my second threaded insert in order for everything to be even and level. Then just put your threaded insert in just like we previously shown on that last one. From there, it's time to essentially repeat the process on the other side, only a little more tricky because both of your rails have to be the same height as one another in order to get that even surface. So I just kind of played around with this for a little while and made sure everything was even, which took a long time, but it's definitely going to be worth it in the end. So as you can tell, once I got everything nice and level, I essentially just repeated that process. Took my hole punch, marked where I needed to pre-drill for my threaded inserts, and then I just put my threaded inserts in just like I did on the other side, making sure to use just a little bit of wood glue. Again, this will just help it stay in place a little longer over time. And once I got those in, I put my sled on there and made sure it worked. I went ahead and threw a level on my jig and slid it across there just to see how level it was. And I know that it's definitely not perfect, but it's close and it'll get the job done. So overall, I was pleased with it. I went ahead and put it to the test on this little mini slab that I had laying around, which, as you'll see in some pictures I show in here in just a minute, had some pretty good twist in it. It did a really good job of taking those high spots out, and overall it flattened it pretty well. I hope you guys got something useful out of this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Until next time.